money, and that sounds almost ridiculous, but I think in this session we're going to give you some insight into that, and not only the problem, but also we've been plugging away for more than 20 years on what an appropriate solution is, and that addresses this systemic issue. And so before going much further, I want to do a brief introduction of the esteemed panelists that we've got join us today. So first of all, I'll introduce Kurt Hoffman. Kurt is a deeply experienced social development thought leader. He was responsible for the establishment and the development over, I think, a dozen years of the Shell Foundation, which was active globally and especially in emerging markets, and has played an important role on many initiatives around social development, also as a development economist. Kurt, if you want to just say hello.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
And then I'd like to introduce Patrick Lowe. Patrick is a seasoned economist. He was, prior to his being the chief economist at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, he was active as an economist at the predecessor of WTO, going back some time, GATT, and then after that also at the World Bank, but deeply experienced in working with a lot of very smart people over his career in economics as it relates to global trade. And welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much, James, and greetings, everybody. James is clearly making an effort to tell everybody my age, but that's okay.
And finally, we have, I'd like to introduce Carl Claes. Carl, I should mention that both Patrick and Kurt have been involved with ECO for quite a number of years in our direct involvement with the enterprise, as well as on an advisory council. And Carl has joined us just recently. Carl comes from a background quite different in working with large multinational corporates in areas of innovation, and also in partnerships, which is hugely important for us. But he did that with for many years with Visa, and then prior to that with Microsoft, and then prior to that with Cisco. Lives in the Middle East, and particularly well established there, which is an area where we are intending to set up a global transaction hub. So I think I'll make a few comments just about how this ECO. Oh, sorry, I meant to say hello, Carl.
Hey, James, thanks for the intro. And I'm hoping the background gives away where I am, but that's good.
Yeah. So, this is going to be relatively informal. We're going to try and leave quite a bit of time for questions at the end. But really the goal here is to help you understand the scale of the problem that I alluded to earlier. And it's not something new. It's something that's been developing over a very long period of time. And this is well documented by many global thought leaders. We'll touch on a few of those. I want to give you some insight into the scale of the problem. I'm just going to reflect on really some of the experience and research, really discoveries and findings of the 20 years of research. It started in a way where, having founded one of the early internet unicorn companies, I wanted to do something with purpose and meaning that was even bigger than the company I had founded, homegrocer.com, which was one of the very early unicorn companies. And when I started to look at marketplaces that could be created, what I wanted to try and find was the biggest market in the world that had the most friction and all the right characteristics. And I stumbled upon this area of non-financial trade. At that time, what I discovered was something called barter, which of course everybody knows because it's the oldest form of commerce, where someone exchanges value with another party for goods or services, but without the use of money. And when I stumbled upon this, I discovered that there was small, what I refer to as mom and pop, very small enterprises around the world that were facilitating the trade of capacity amongst small businesses generally, but also sometimes amongst farmers through co-ops. And these were all doing these trades without the use of money. And some of them had different community currencies and local barter credit systems. And I was just fascinated by the extent to which this is going on. And you know, caused me to think that this was a market that could be produced online. And anyhow, that led to many years of research. And the idea simply was, let's create a marketplace for capacity, because all these organizations were trading their capacity with each other. So I went out and I acquired the domain name barter.com, thinking I'm going to create an online marketplace for barter. And Patrick will have a chuckle because we have an ongoing debate about the role of barter in the future of the economy. And so the idea, think of a simple analogy of Airbnb. Airbnb was just taking unused capacity in people's homes. It was always there, putting it in a global market so it could be traded and creating, you know, a $60 billion enterprise by unlocking this capacity. And, you know, I started to think about unlocking the capacity of the world that's not being used, whether it's human capacity, mineral or natural resource capacity, production capacity, any capacity, put it in a global market so it could be traded. And this is the idea of barter.com. However, as I began advancing that, I realized that everything was about trust and confidence, and, you know, tried to imagine what the pillars of trust and confidence were. And that was a couple-year exercise. And what we discovered, interestingly, is that people actually today trust big multinational corporates more than they trust governments. And so we said, look, let's design this so that big multinational corporates will be early movers, and therefore you will have trust just by the fact that the users are big multinationals. And as we began to advance that, something very important emerged. And it started by this fellow on this next slide. If I can just get to that next slide. His name is Dee Hock. And Dee is the founder of, is everybody able to see the slide? No?
James, now we can see.
Oh, yeah. Jane. Yep. Oh, thank you, Jane. So this fellow's name is Dee Hock. He is the founder of Visa, the credit card company. Probably all of you have one in your pocket. But when I met him, he was presenting at a conference for Young Entrepreneurs Organization. And he told the story about Visa and how every bank had their own credit card, plastic systems, and, you know, there was no usability. And it looked to me like this world of barter with all these fragmented users and systems. And I went up and approached him to see if I could bring him onto my advisory council. And I asked him if that was possible. And he said, well, is it for profit or non-profit? I said, well, it's for profit, but it has a big social dimension. And he said, oh, well, I'm not doing anything for profit at this stage in my life, but what is it? And I said, well, it's this idea I have called barter.com. And he looked at me with his piercing blue eyes and he reached his hand out and he said, son, you don't know this, but you're onto something that can change the whole world of commerce. Is desperately needed because it overcomes one of the main problems of commerce that are a function of sovereign currency. Well, that led to another, set of discoveries, and maybe I'll just share one other. The next slide is another fellow who is a global thought leader, Smithsonian honorary. Max Hopper was the founder of what was the biggest B2B marketplace in the early 90s, actually, and which was the American Airlines global system for airlines to basically exchange their capacities as they, when you buy a ticket, you use multiple legs of multiple airlines. And it was interesting because he made a presentation at the first B2B conference, which I also presented at as a founder of one of the B2C companies. And he made this comment about, technology and online marketplaces will make lowest friction transactions possible. And so I just thought, oh my God, and he said, like barter at scale. And so I really thought we were on the right track, but realized that in fact, there was a really other missing and very important ingredient. And it came about when we started to engage the big corporates, and they started to say, well, look, the biggest friction in all of these non-financial trades that we're doing, swaps and reciprocal trade and counter trade and barter trade, they had about 50 terms describing this non-financial trade. But the biggest friction and the biggest challenge was they had to take counterparties' goods as payment. And that, of course, led me to wondering about, well, why aren't they using money? And that led to another whole fascinating discovery about the problems of money. And this next person really kind of hit this home. And he's a Nobel laureate, godfather of the euro, perhaps the most notable economists of the last couple hundred years, Robert Mundell, and Canadian, who I was introduced to by Art Laffer, another of our advisors, who's the chief economist, was the chief economist of 5 US presidents. And he, Bob Mundell, when I met him and explained all this research we had been doing, and at this point it was more than 6 years, but we had found all of this non-financial trade happening at all different levels of society, from the poorest cooperative towns in Africa to the biggest multinational corporates, Boeing and GE, and also big governments. And at each layer, the non-financial trade that we discovered was really inefficient and difficult and risky. And again, had all these great characteristics for a marketplace. And Robert Mundell, when I explained to him and asked if he could join the advisor council, he just said, look, what you've discovered is absolute evidence of a massive global market failure that no one wants to talk about, and that's money. And so on that note, let me just come to, first of all, Kurt. Kurt, you've done some quite interesting work on a narrative around the global financial system, its evolution. Could you make some comments about that?
Yes, hi, James. Hi, everyone. Okay, I'll do that, but I'll try not to, I won't start globally. I'll start very micro in a sense, with an important lesson that I learned when I joined after 20 years as a development economist in various projects and so on, typical projects associated with really trying to generate production capacity, competitive production capacity in developing countries. But after 20 years, I was fortunate enough to find myself invited to create the Shell Foundation. That was an interesting occurrence for me because I'd spent many years fighting against the role of multinationals as a force for underdevelopment in developing countries. But nevertheless, I went forward with it. And when I discovered it, when I got inside and began to develop the ideas for the foundation and understand where the focus should be and what the outreach could be, I was really struck by 2 or 3 things. First, that my budget with the foundation was going to be about $500 million, which may seem a lot of money, but what I found out is that Shell's annual capital expenditure, this is now over 10 years ago, was $160 billion a year, $180 billion a year. So on a scale that absolutely dwarfed any project that I had ever been involved in, and indeed the projects that many developing institutions like the World Bank and UN agencies and all the erstwhile NGOs working to generate economic capacity in developing countries. So that was the scale that they operate. Second thing I realized, I discovered is that while I was an economist and thought I knew a lot about poverty and development, what I realized I didn't know that Shell had an abundance, and indeed any big successful commercial company in the productive enterprise, was a massive amount of knowledge and capability and expertise that they managed and organized in order to generate big projects that they could produce and make them profits and so on they wanted. So it was a massive resource to gain access that they had access to. But what I began to think of is that, well, much more than the money that Shell was going to give me to invest in projects and so on, I wanted to be able to access these capabilities, because they were not only diverse in terms of the nature of the capabilities, but Shell had, 10,000 engineers working around the world. The numbers were just vast. So I began a journey in developing the foundation's focus as really a small enterprise investment vehicle to figure out how to use the capacity, the global spread of big companies, their global operation and their global reservoir of capabilities and so on, to deliver on the development agenda that I had in working with small enterprises in a few countries at a time. And it was those sort of lessons that I went on and explored within the Shell Foundation and had great fun and great success with, that really came back to, haunt me is the wrong word, but when I first learned about James's set of ideas in the eco world, the eco capacity and so on, I realized, like some of the people he had been talking to, was that whilst those of us in the development business often pretend to be involved in tackling global problems and so on, actually most all of us work on a very small scale. And that's because of the nature of the delivery mechanism and the channels through which we deliver finance and expertise in order to generate a successful business here, get small farmers producing here and so on. So it was a scale thing that really captured me, that James's idea had, because what James needed to start with, and James, you'll probably explain, was a market, an infrastructure of member companies who collectively could really constitute a market large enough to support trading activities. So that was the first thing to appreciate, the connection with big companies. And James, I hope you'll explain the core nature of the production sectors we work in and so on. Yeah. And then the second thing was almost immediately impossible to ignore, and I'll finish with this, was the fact that James was talking about currency, money, in a sort of a way. And it took me a year of study after that to understand exactly what he was talking about. But he had stumbled on, through his journey through the barter store and everything, a systemic intervention in the world of investment finance, although it has much wider applications, that had global applicability. And in particular, if you thought about the avenues that people like myself were working in a place like Shell, he also had the capacity to channel that the finance intervention in many places all at once. So it remains the only systemic intervention capable of supporting systemic change in the whole complex of development that I've been working on for many years. It's the only one if you stop and think about it. And maybe James can sort of illuminate that a little bit when he comes back to it. But it's those two things that this starts with being a productive enterprise driven activity structured around only initially the interaction of large economic enterprises. But remember, along with them come supply chains that are many tens of thousands of actors involved, and their presence taken together is in all of the countries in the emerging markets that those of us who worry about poverty in developing countries are interested in. And that's the thing that I found so important and have committed the last 10 years to trying to help advance. How do we harness this unique innovation that James has come up with, starting with Barter, but going way beyond that, and to make it available with all its benefits, which James, I'm sure you'll say eventually, most importantly, it's interest-free and free of finance charges and all that sort of thing. And that is the single, again, talk about systemic, that is the single most important constraint, in my view, on the development process, which is the inability and difficulties that local productive enterprises, startups or established have in gaining access to productive investment that they can channel to generate companies and products and sell and do wealth. And obviously, if they do it well, they can do it in a sustainable way and an equitable way. So I'll sort of stop there.
That's great. Kurt, thank you very much. Look, I want to try and kind of wrap up the summary around the problem and the systemic issues. And, I've come back to, the point you're making about access to credit, access to finance is holding back enterprises, it's holding back governments. It's the single biggest thing holding back probably every single person on this call. I found in engaging with social entrepreneurs, they all have incredible ideas about what they can be doing to make a difference in the world. And the only reason they're not doing it is because they're constrained by resources to do their initiatives and projects and enterprises and or scale them because of lack of capital. Yet, if we look at the world, there's not a shortage of capacity. It is absolutely abundant. Human capacity, mineral capacity, arable land capacity, construction capacity. I mean, any kind of capacity you imagine. Every company that exists has it because they want to grow. They must have capacity to grow into for future demand. And so if you think about capacity as the money of the world, like it was in the beginning of time, I mean, how many camels you had, how many sheep you had, your ability to produce bushels of wheat was the money that you had and you traded it. Well, let's look at the world's capacity as the money of the world and create a system that can unlock that as new forms of credit that could then finance some of these kinds of initiatives that are being held back and constraining achievement of the SDGs, but of economic development generally. Before I wrap up on this point there are just a couple of more important things to kind of, I think, hit home. And Carl, maybe you could just give a perspective from the problems of money from a corporate standpoint, given your experience, especially in emerging markets. And I know there's a particular Nigeria example that illuminates this, and you may have some others too, but please, if you could just make a comment about the challenge from the corporate side going into emerging markets.
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the key challenges you find across the emerging markets, and certainly with a lot of these economies which are trying to build infrastructure and also accelerate their digital transformation, the challenge is systemic in the sense that their currencies are obviously challenged and quite volatile. And so in essence, I can share one specific example in terms of a country in Nigeria, obviously in Africa, which had a contractual arrangement with one of the entities I was a part of in my historical past. And the challenge was on the renewal of contracts. And it was for absorption of capacity from a product and service that we provided to them. It was a cloud service. And really what it was on the renewal side, they had purchased the product and the service in their own, obviously in their own currency, but the payment terms were based on the US dollar. And so with the fluctuating currency, they were unable, or they were challenged to meet payments on time. And obviously, you know, we went through a fairly deep negotiation with that. What that revealed and exposed was they actually had a lot of capacity, this certain enterprise and government, to pay, but not necessarily in their currency of operation and trade. So when I met James last year, we started to talk about what Eco brings to the table and what it's solving for. It immediately hit home, because I'd seen this in multiple lives in my corporate life, not only in that world I just described, but when I look at some of the growing economies of the world, if I start to think of Egypt, I start to think of, you know, Turkey, I start to think of other places in Asia, which are certainly looking for infrastructure to grow and transform their economies. They need some kind of a leverage to be able to utilize their capacity as a way or a form of exchange for, you know, that infrastructure. We're seeing already with China coming into key markets, offering favorable finance terms, but not everyone can really address or sign up to some of those terms, which result in probably transfer of ownership of assets. So this challenge exists. It exists not only, I think, in activating inactive economies. I think it also can solve for developed markets' opportunity to export and be much more able to have stronger trade initiatives. I look at my home country in Australia, and we've got a huge amount of capacity there. But not necessarily do we have the opportunity to go and engage in other parts of the world because of the the challenge in fulfilling payments or in getting those trades and services activated. So I think this, to me, is real. It's there. The corporate enterprise and the corporate world is looking for growth. We're seeing challenges now with inflation and, you know, this talks about recession and other things, but this could be a really important part, and the timing could be critical right now to bring that to bear and then help, you know, activate sustainable economies rather than just growing economies.
That's great. Hey, Carl, thank you very much. Look, just a couple more thoughts on this. Patrick, since you've had, you know, first a frontline seat on global trade and how global trade has been impacted by the challenges of money, interest, inflation, volatility, and so on. Could you just give a bit of a perspective about, now that you understand the ideas of around capacity trade, you know, give us a view from your lens on the challenges of money in global trade.
Okay, thanks, James. The first thing I'd like to say, though, is that I don't think there's a huge distinction to be made between trade within an economy and international trade. The only additional factor is exchange rates, but the same challenges relating to money arise. And what we're really talking about is a situation that is like economic history could be coming full circle in one sense. Back in the day, there was barter, and barter, simple barter, it still exists. I mean, I come from Kenya, I was born there, I spent a lot of time there. There are still traditional societies outside the money economy who still do traditional barter. But the thing with that is it's quite constraining, because traditional barter requires that you have a double coincidence of wants. I've got to want something that you have, and you have to have something I want, and in that moment. And it's a two-way exchange, essentially. What this solution does is take us back to exchange of goods and services for goods and services. What it does is to remind us of where money first came from and what it was used for. When it was first used, and barter became a little more sophisticated, it was simply as a unit of account, so you could have multiple exchanges of different kinds of value, and a medium of exchange. So what then happened was that it took on this third element over time. And this third element was it became a store of value. And if it's a store of value, it has intrinsic, it generates intrinsic interest in terms of holding money. You hold money to, you hope that you can hold money and get an exchange rate advantage, or you hold money because you hope you can get an advantage in the financial market. So with shares, you hold it because you may even want to influence market outcomes. But the eco solution just gets rid of all that, because the eco solution, the eco is the unit of account, it is the medium of exchange, and that's it. And all you need is an exchange. Why is this different from traditional barter? It's like barter on steroids because you create an exchange. And you have a broker-assisted exchange where if you have something that isn't, a lot of people talk about excess capacity, it could even be newly generated capacity. You can take it to the exchange and get something in return that you need. You simply get around the problem of having to manage money. Now, of course, in international trade, it matters quite a lot, because you've got to, countries like Kenya, like my country, we have a tremendous problem of foreign exchange scarcity right now, and a tremendous problem of reserves. You could short circuit all that, and not just on developmental grounds, but in general. You could short circuit all that by swapping value for value right up front, just like that.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you. So look, just in wrapping up on the summary around the systemic problem of money that I think everyone can relate to as a constraining factor globally for development, I just want to highlight some recent work from a fellow, and Jane, if you could give me the next slide, please, with Mr. Jacques de la Rosière. Jacques is the past head of the IMF, and he was the governor of the Bank of France and the president of EBRD. And he's written a lot of papers and some books on this topic of the problems that have occurred in the world. His latest essay is Putting an End to the Reign of Financial Illusion. And he talks about that in recent years, over the last 20 years primarily, that because of loose monetary policy, we've been basically printing money with nothing behind it. And of course, it's inevitable that's going to drive inflation and potentially cause other systemic problems that we don't even and can't anticipate because we have no historical representation or experience of such loose monetary policy. In other words, printing of money at such an unprecedented level.
There's a deep work that we do, build structures in society. That is overlooked. In fact, these are all societal / government perspectives. How does CSR look at civil society?
I'm not sure what happened there, but it somehow ended up with someone else's presentation. Are we okay now, Jane?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry. So anyhow, look, I'm not going to go any further. I think it's time for us to start to talk about the solution. Everyone has alluded to it. Let me just introduce the next slide, which is the vision. And I apologize, it's not crystal clear because I ended up making a copy from a slide, but I'll read it to you. So the vision that we, after a long time and a lot of research, many years, is that, look, there's so much unused capacity in the world. If we could find a way to unlock that, think of, again, Airbnb for empty rooms, but forget that. Let's take the unused capacity of the world, like Patrick was referring to. If you could enable that to be utilized, you would improve economic conditions globally. And so the simple vision we had was, look, let's improve economic and social conditions through better utilization of the world's available capacity. And then you don't have to chase money. And so the problem then is, how do you do that? And you'll see now in a few seconds, our approach. But you introduce an improved mechanism, economic mechanism, to recognize and exchange value that's more inclusive, more equitable, more trustworthy. That is the heart of economic and social justice. And so is barter the answer? And this is where, again, I enjoy always having a debate with Patrick, because, you know, to me, barter isn't the answer. The problem is the medium of exchange. It's the concept of a currency that someone can have trust in, but removing the store of value feature from it, which is what's causing it to be an instrument of making money for money, and hence the financialization of the global economy that de la Rosière reflects on as a big systemic problem, and same as Mundell. And so, and because this is an economics problem, it's the existing global monetary system problem is a political problem, because you have 192 independent sovereign currencies, each country acting in self-interest, and that's how politicians get elected. And therefore, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to get them to think of the common good of the global commerce. And so we have a very difficult problem to overcome. And we didn't set out trying to fix the global monetary system. We just wanted to help enterprises to do trade more efficiently. And to do that, we had to create a marketplace. But more importantly, we had to create something else that was critical to that. And so we can go to the next slide. And so we created an integrated solution. It has basically three elements. So the first element is a marketplace like the capacity exchange, where you allow anyone who has unused capacity can populate it into the exchange, like an Airbnb for capacity globally. The second is you have to have an instrument that if money isn't available, but capacity, real economy assets are, you need something that represents those assets, an instrument of value. Again, if you go back in history, it used to be things like shells and tally sticks. They weren't intrinsically valued, didn't have the value element. It was just mediums of exchange and units of account. And so we created something called an ECO. And we looked at that as an enterprise-backed credit obligation, because we figured if we want the biggest enterprises in the world, because that's what everyone trusts, we'll get them to back it in some way. And that led to the next important part of the innovation, which is Eco World Alliance. When you receive payment in an alternative instrument, or any instrument, whether it be a sovereign currency, a cryptocurrency, a Bitcoin, a community currency, a barter credit, you have to always ask basically three questions. Can I account for it? Rules are pretty clear. Number two, can I use it? This is a liquidity issue. And most of them, sort of the US dollar, highly liquid. Zimbabwe dollar, not so liquid. Cryptocurrency, terribly illiquid. And then if you go to the next important question is, how much trust can I have holding it? You have to look at where it comes from. And there is the key. When you look at where all of these sovereign currencies come from, the 192, and you ask the question, how much trust can I have in those, let alone the cryptocurrencies and community currencies, and you ask the question, how much trust can I have holding this? Who's the lender of last resort? The answer is not good in almost every single case. Even the US dollar today, we're seeing leading global economists talking about, diminishing role of the US dollar as a global reserve currency. But the reality is it's still the best of what's there. And so it remains as the global reserve currency. But it has many issues of no more gold, no more assets behind it, a high volatility, inflation risks, et cetera, deep deficits and debt. And so the ECO, instead, we created a global structure of only investment grade entities from the global corporate sector that are the backers of the instrument. And that gives you a constant investment grade backed instrument that you can receive and hold with a high degree of trust. I mean, it's the best form of credit backstop. So the next slide, these are just the highlight elements of how it was designed for trust and confidence. And I think I'll jump off to the next slide. And so actually, you know what, let's go out of the slide for a moment, because I want to just come back to some questions to the panelists. Kurt, first of all, could you just talk a bit more about having such a solution as ECO is proposing? How can you see that having an impact in an emerging market?
Okay, well, I'll be as practical as I can with one of the pilot projects we set out to design to work with the ECO. It's all about the production of chilies in Southern Africa. Chilies are a major global crop, as you know, and unique growing places in places that are hot. So Southern Africa, many countries are key. And it happens also that production of chilies takes place at a very small scale farmers and so on. And they are, as typical, always dependent, running year after year on whether or not they have a good enough harvest, and then whether or not they get good enough price on selling their crop on whatever markets they can gain access to. And then if they do well enough to have the aspiration to try and invest a little more in more production capacity, they almost never have enough from the sale, and they need to go to a financing entity, local bank, to get that. And invariably, the finance is very hard to access when you're a small farmer, almost impossible. The price is way too high if they even talk to you about it. And therefore they have the capacity to increase their production and therefore could sell more in the market, but they can't translate that capacity, physical capacity, into productive capacity, and they can't get their product to market, going all the way back to the lack of access to finance. When we worked with a number of big companies in operating in Eastern Africa and who were in the agricultural commodities business, they turned out to be, they had the access to the global market. They were the companies that sold chilies to the massive users of chilies in the restaurant sector and so on. And they had the ability to, if they chose to use their capacity, which was manifest in both their locally owned production subsidiaries, but also their subcontractors, to secure a loan of ECOs from our central bank, that they could then turn around and use to purchase through their subcontractors, purchase inputs, and subcontractors, large companies themselves, could then work with small suppliers and so on to channel those inputs from seed down to. So can I go ahead? Yeah. To purchase, gain access to those inputs. Previously, they had no finance. They had bad, limited trading relationships with a very small number of intermediates. When you get these structured subcontractors involved who come equipped with your ECOs that they can spend to acquire the production ingredients that are needed to channel to the small farmers to produce the capacity, suddenly you have a way of unleashing the power of finance to get it converted into intermediate inputs that small farmers can use to produce. They then turn around, wait for the chilies to be produced, and then they can purchase the chilies from their subcontractors, purchase the chilies from their small farmers at the agreed price, and they can then go back to the ECO bank and convert the chilies and their loan into to repay their loan and make it work that way. So that you open up, and that's working in a very, agriculture, not quite subsistence, but very small scale agriculture with the small producers far away from local markets. And it opens up a vehicle that, again, remember, get access to finance. So, and the cost of accessing finance is zero in that sense. And it made made tremendous difference in increasing the scale of the operations over 2 or 3 years of the local farmers involved in this one chili production project.
Thanks for sharing that tangible example. Carl, could you just give a high-level thoughts just about the benefits from a large corporate standpoint of being able to harness an alternative source of finance like ECO?
Yeah, I think one of the important ones for corporates is they've already built in capacity in their operations. So if I think of, I'm not going to name a name, but I'll put it straight out in terms of an example of a service where you have capacity in terms of consultants or people which need to provide a service to an organization. Let's take an example. I'll throw one out there and say an Accenture type of organization which has thousands of consultants out there. They deal with clients such as airlines, clients such as government, and others. But if we look at it at a real life example, there's no reason why potentially an airline or a client in the enterprise space who needs that kind of service to come to an agreement to exchange, for example, as an airline seats in exchange for those services that someone like an Accenture or other consultancy could provide, and allow for that capacity that's already been paid for on the balance sheet of an organization such as Accenture to then be utilized for services for that airline to help them in their transformation or digital transformation, as an example. In exchange for that, there is no reason why that airline wouldn't accept ECO, maybe not for directly those services, maybe partially for some of those services, but then utilize that for other ECO Alliance members. Let's assume another member is a highly liquid partner, such as an ADNOC or a Shell, and utilize that for exchange of fuel to help them in making payment for fuel charges. That is a big issue right now in terms of costs of energy and costs of fuel. And so if you just take the one simple example there, two very large global corporates leveraging ECO as a way of a medium of exchange to unlock capacity which is already built in and paid for, but also to utilize that medium of exchange at ECO with a trustworthy investment grade corporation. And I think this is the key. These ECO Alliance members are investment grade, trusted global enterprises. We're already seeing it today in the world of payments. There's more trust in Apple to provide you a bank deposit with a higher interest rate than there is for banks. And so if you start to think of the fact that there's the trust factor sitting with the global enterprises, then I think there's a huge opportunity here to unlock the capacity, but also, it's a sustainable economic model over the long term. And going back to the roots of where I am in the region, I mean, if you take the concept of souks were originated out of here where, thousands of years ago, even hundreds of years ago, it was all around exchanges of, one-to-one, camels for dates or spices for oils, whatever it was. So we're going back to real economies, and we're going back to the real tangible. So, and I think that's, in the enterprise world, that's needed now. It's no longer just about printing money. It's more about this.
Thank you, Carl. Patrick, I see we're running very short on time, but I did want to just get one more comment from you briefly about ECO's solution as a mechanism for unlocking and increasing global trade.
Yeah, I mean, I think depends what kind of trade you're talking about. It depends what countries are involved. Some countries don't have foreign exchange shortages, others do. If you don't have the capacity to buy what you need, you have a developmental problem, and you get into debt, and then you end up in a situation where many developing countries today are going to need to get debt refinancing, and that's a nightmare for them. Yeah. So if you can get around that, there are all sorts of things you can do it even with governments, with foreign governments, or with the corporate sector. You can arrange exchanges which allow you to generate income and jobs in order to be able to buy what you want to buy, because they will buy what you have to offer. And it's what Kurt was saying. You don't have to go through the money system. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here, and it's not just development; it's also efficient for advanced economies who are looking for ways of short-circuiting the financial markets and reducing the risk associated with dealing with them.
Yeah, I mean, this overcoming the terrible inefficiencies and high costs and risks of the current system. It's not hard to imagine that there's immense opportunity there. Look, we are running short for time. Let's open it up for questions and see if there's anybody that wants to pose a question. Otherwise, I will certainly be able to put a few more out. Jane, I'm not sure the best way how that's done.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet.
Okay, good. So then let's go. So look, we've talked about the systemic problem of money. We've talked about the impacts that it has on development from a number of different standpoints: emerging markets, multinational corporates, and generally on trade. We've talked about the solution that ECO has been pioneering and advancing. Look, one of the biggest challenges, and I always kind of reflect back on my life and that this has been 22 years of intense work globally. I was trying to calculate how many meetings has it involved, and it's well over 30,000. And how many multinational corporates have we engaged? Well over 600. We've gotten a sponsorship from 2 multinational governments, Chinese and the UK governments, but also, we're engaged with another 25 governments. And these are all high-level C-suite executives in corporates, ministers, prime ministers, and in some case, presidents, rulers of countries. I mean, it's fascinating. Everyone is interested in the idea of an alternative solution that can unlock their capacity as a new form of credit. And that is really what the ECO solution is about. And it's a way of doing that and eliminating all kinds of costs that are associated normally with the activity of acquiring financing or investment. And it removes a number of the risks of volatility and so on that are concerns, especially for corporations doing business globally. I had a great quote from the past chairman and CEO of Coca-Cola. When I was introducing this solution to him, he said, "Gosh, we need a solution like this." He said, "We do business in 206 countries. In every country, our contracts require payment in US dollars." He said, "In many countries, we can't get US dollars." He said, "So we either take domestic currencies or we take assets." And we find we are increasingly taking assets because we get a better financial treatment than having to assume the risks associated with domestic currencies in some of these emerging markets. And he said, and then we have a wholly owned subsidiary that just monetizes those assets. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's extraordinary. We need a solution. It has to be global. It has to be stable. And this is a really important thing. Stability, not volatility. Banks don't mind volatility. They can make money. Traders make lots of money on speculating on volatility. But corporates don't want volatility. They want stability. They want predictability. And so we designed the ECO as an instrument for corporates, not realizing that in fact was a better concept of money because it wasn't acting in, again, self-interest of any particular nation, but it was acting as a medium to facilitate more efficient, more reliable, more trustworthy trade. So, so that is a big picture. Of course, the challenge with that, as this just, got bigger in scale and bigger in scope, is, you face difficulties of innovation, which is status quo and, people protecting territories and resistance to change, and these things that are really huge constraints to change. And even though the solution economically is rock solid and sound, you face the challenge of as I said, status quo. So that's one of the biggest difficulties for us, and it's why we want to engage, all the Catalyst members to contribute to collaboration and assembling of the resources and engagement of the stakeholders globally that can make it all happen. So I know we're coming on to be out of time. I don't know if we have a moment for a quick one-word comment by each of the panelists, but can we do that as a closing? Just let's one word. And for me, it's the time is now. Anyone else? Carl.
I mean, for me, yeah. I mean, it's the same. It's if it's not now, then when? So,
Kurt.
I have a business relationship with some colleagues in Mozambique. We were in the business of supporting the development of small enterprises in the hospitality industry and the beer industry, to be honest. And we were going great guns, I don't know, 10 years or so ago, because the Mozambican economy was booming because of the discovery of gas offshore and multinationals coming in and wanting to be really interested in taking advantage of Mozambique's weak situation to get the best deal for them that they do to extract the gas and sell on the markets. And there was so everything was booming, but then of course you probably all know that along came a few credible representatives of the international finance system, including Credit Suisse and Russian banks and a French bank and so on. And they managed to come up with a deal that was able to make available $2 billion in loans to the president and 2 or 3 other top executives in the country for the purchase of non-existent boats that they needed to protect their non-existent offshore fishing industry. So the whole of the Mozambican economy collapsed and couldn't trade their economies. It's longer than one word, but it's a good story. They couldn't trade on them on the international markets and so on. And the generation of entrepreneurs that I was working with were completely stymied in their growth plans in sectors of all sorts of places. I had 90,000 pounds invested and stuck in Mozambique and unable to be realized because the interest rate in Mozambique, even 8 years after that scandal came about, is for small enterprises such as we were working with, is 40%.
Oh. Unbelievable.
40%. And that's of course all the sectors. So that's a long one word, but it hurts when you lose financial control and financial access. And it helps if you could have control over the finance, because then you can direct it in the way you need it to do.
Well, and if you have real economy assets, you have control over them. So we get away from a big problem. Thank you for sharing that. Some final words, Patrick?
Yeah, just to say that this is a relatively new idea because the technology to make it possible is now available. And it's really important, I think, for the future of the world economy, for its health, that this becomes part of the way business is conducted in the future. Damn good idea it is.
Well, thank you, Kurt, Carl, Patrick, for your contributions today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Look, now that we know the solution, it's time to act. Let's work together to implement ECO and create a better world for all. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.